Howdy! In this mini lecture we will discuss environmental economics. The student learning objectives of this mini lecture are: explain how our economies exist within the environment and rely on ecosystem services, describe the principles of classical and neoclassical economics and summarize their implications for the environment, and explain the pursuit of sustainable development. It's important to note that economies exist within the natural environment. The economy receives resources from the environment, discharges waste into the environment, and benefits from ecosystem services. However, conventional neoclassical economics has only focused on the processes of production and consumption between households and businesses, excluding the natural resources, which are required for the products of the economy and the waste products the activities of the economy produce. Notice the yellow box in the center of this figure illustrates this concept. In this regard, neoclassical economics views the environment as merely an external factor that helps enable the production of goods. A more holistic approach is environmental economics or ecological economics, which explicitly recognize the economies exist within the natural environment and depend on the environment for ecosystem services, natural resources, and waste acceptance. There are four assumptions of neoclassical economics that often contribute to environmental degradation. The first is, resources are infinite or substitutable. But think about that. This assumption implies that once we deplete a resource, we will always find a replacement. This is true of some resources, however not all. Is oil, natural gas, and coal infinite? The second is, costs and benefits are internal, meaning that those directly involved in a transaction, example, the buyer and seller, are the only ones affected by the costs and benefits of the transaction. Most transactions affect other people in society beyond the buyer and seller. If a forest is cut down, the air quality decreases, there's less wildlife, and water quality can be impaired. People beyond the lumber company and their clients are affected by their actions, meaning people not involved in the cost of the transaction pay a cost to the degrading of the environment. These types of costs are called external costs, which are defined as costs of transactions that affect people other than the buyer and seller alone. When these costs have a negative impact on others, they are called negative externalities. Some examples of negative externalities include health problems, stress and anxiety for people living downstream of pollution, declining real estate values, loss of tourism revenue, and increases in healthcare expenses because a factory which spews pollution nearby, declines in environmental feature, such as fish stocks, aesthetic damage from air pollution, strip mining, or clear cutting. The third assumption of neoclassical economics is discounting of the future. Neoclassical economics assumes that events in the future are worth less than the present, so the future is discounted. Following this train of thought, humans grant more importance to the present rather than the future. For example, if a stand of trees slated for lumber is discounted at 5%, the stand is worth $500,000 today, but in 10 years it's only worth $299,368. So the lumber company makes more if they cut the trees down today. Discounting encourages policymakers to play down economic consequences of decisions. Many environmental problems unfold gradually, so discounting discourages addressing them and passes the cost of dealing with the environmental problem onto future generations. Neoclassical economics assumes that all growth is good and that this growth essentially maintains social order because a growing economy can create opportunities for the poor and everyone will get a slice of an even bigger pie. This is a good thing for greater human well-being, but growth can become an end unto itself and may no longer be a good thing. For example, the idea of affluenza is that consumption of material wealth to a degree will not lead to happiness. Some fear that the endless pursuit of wealth cannot be maintained because this pursuit will eventually destroy our economy because we run out of goods. My thought on this is that growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of a cancer cell. Another thought to consider in this vein of growth for the sake of growth is how sustainable is economic development. The global economy has grown 7 times its size from just 50 years ago. All measures of economic activity are up. For example, trade, rates of production, amount and value of goods produced. However, while many people have gained much from economic growth, the gap between the rich and the poor is still growing. Economic growth stems from 2 sources. 1, increases in inputs to the economy, meaning more labor or natural resources, and 2, improvements to efficiency of production due to better technologies and approaches so that we produce more goods with less inputs. Economic development is made possible if we can produce more with less. If we are producing more good with fewer inputs, it's likely because technologies have allowed us to operate more efficiently. Human ingenuity and technical improvement allow us to overcome environmental limitations, and some argue allow us to have infinite economic growth. Depending on where you stand on this issue, you should be classified as either a Cassandra or a cornucopian. Cornucopian believes that we, as humans, will always be able to rely on our ingenuity and the technology we develop to continue to overcome environmental limitations. A Cassandra believes that Earth has a finite amount of resources and that if we don't manage current resources sustainably, economies and societies will collapse. However, this can be avoided by achieving sustainability. Here is a figure that displays data from the Happy Planet Index alongside ecological footprint size. The Happy Planet Index is used to assess nations for the sustainable well-being by measuring the happiness for their citizens together with their prospect for happiness. Notice that Costa Ricans rate high on the index, while still having a below-average ecological footprint. Look to see where Western countries fall in comparison. Clearly, it's possible to be happy without having a massive ecological footprint. This gets back to the idea of affluenza. What we have hinted at but not fully discussed are the non-market values associated with the environment. These values include the existence, use, option, aesthetic, scientific, educational, and cultural value. These are values which do not have a dollar amount associated with them, but do have worth to humans. For example, you likely receive aesthetic value from viewing a beautiful natural landscape. You may have a favorite animal you want protected but will never see, such as a polar bear or a Bengal tiger. You may want the option to do something later, such as hiking in a forest in California. All of these are non-market values. They can be measured using contingent valuation, which essentially uses surveys to determine how much money people would be willing to pay to protect or restore a resource. Full cost accounting means accounting for these non-market values. Gross domestic product is a standard economic measure for assessing the size of a nation's economy. However, GDP is a poor indicator of economic well-being. GDP doesn't account for non-market values and it lumps all economic activity together, whether it's good or bad. For example, following an oil spill, there is massive pollution released into the environment, but the GDP will only account for money spent on cleaning up the spill and will not decrease because of the spill. Some economists have tried to develop indicators that differentiate between desirable and undesirable economic activity and that can function as better guides of citizens' well-being. The Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, is one alternative to GDP. The GPI considers both the positive and negative impacts to the economy and accounts for some non-market values. The GPI subtracts external environmental costs, such as pollution, social costs, such as divorce and crime, and economic costs, such as borrowing and the gap between the rich and the poor. In this way, the GPI captures what the GDP does not, and provides a more accurate representation of a nation's economy. In the graph on the right, you see that per capita U.S. GDP has increased significantly since 1950. Yet per capita U.S. GPI leveled off in 1975. What do you think about using GDP versus GPI to measure economic progress? There is a lot of talk about sustainability and sustainable development. Recall that sustainability is using resources in such a way that the current generations can meet their needs, but that such consumption doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainability is a three-pronged issue. In order to achieve sustainability, we must account for and include environmental, social, and economic goals, meaning we cannot hope to live sustainably unless we consider things like keeping the environment clean from pollution, ensuring people have access to education and sanitation, and minimizing the wealth and poverty gap. Can you see how all of these things fit together to achieve sustainability? Sustainable development is a global movement. In 2000, leaders of the world came together to adopt the United Nations Millennium Declaration and set forth the 8 Millennium Development Goals for 2015. These goals relate directly back to sustainable development. Give this some thought and see if you can think of how these goals relate to sustainable development. Environmental scientists have used data to project future trends in human population, resource availability, food production, industrial output, and pollution. In the graph you see a projection for a world in which society pursues policies typical of the 20th century, but this requires 2 times as many resources to be discovered and extracted as are now accessible. In this scenario, population and production rise until declining resources cause them to crash. Consequently, pollution also skyrockets in this scenario. In the lower graph, a scenario in which policies which are aimed at sustainability is shown. The population levels off at 8 billion. Production rises and resource availability stabilizes at medium levels. Pollution also declines to low levels. This concludes the mini lecture on environmental economics. Please review the weekly outline and complete the activities for this week per the schedule set forth in the outline. Thanks and gig 'em!